Jacksonville, Florida. And I do really appreciate everybody taking their time out of their busy day to talk about builder's risk today. This is another one of our webinars and our ongoing series of webinars. And I like to think they're very educational. We will be product specific at times, but we will answer any questions that pertain to the inland marine builder's risk line of business. And as I was thinking about a topic of this month, obviously this time of year, we start thinking about catastrophes, and from everything from the wildfires out west to the severe convective storms in the Midwest to the tropical storms in the southeast and east. These are all catastrophic events that occur, and I know we've done these before in the past. And we will touch on a few things on what you can do before the storm hits, but I would also like to touch on today, what do we do after the storm's gone? What happens then? We've learned a lot in the last several years about things, how to handle claims, how to write business on properties that were damaged by catastrophes. So we're going to talk a little bit about after the storm today too. So we'll run through this fairly quickly, and then we will open it up for questions. And as always, any questions you have on anything to do with builder's risk, you can ask me about other things, but I think I know more about builder's risk, and we will do our best to answer the question today. So rebuilding after the catastrophe. These are kind of looking back too. Sometimes we look back, you can look at a number of years, but 2020 had some very interesting catastrophes, as always. So billion-dollar events. Now, I don't know if this was insured values or just overall. I think it was insured values. We had 7 tropical cyclones that caused over $1 billion. 13 severe convective storms that caused over $1 billion in damage. And I find that very interesting because you think of those being the tornadoes in the Midwest, but we're going to get into that a little bit today. They're happening in other places. We had the drought in the Midwest and in the West Coast, and leading to a wildfire that was over $1 billion. So these are some of the events that we're going to talk about today. I know there's other catastrophes. We don't have time today to talk about, we're not going to spend much time on flood a little bit. We're not going to spend a lot of time on earthquake, things like that, volcanoes. We're going to focus on these right here, I think. So the one piece to this too is, what do we think is going to happen in the future? And I know we all read all this stuff, and I don't want to get too deep into it today, but there is a lot of science around this now. We are starting to see an increase in all of these events that we're talking about. And we can talk about, why these things are happening, but more importantly, I think we have to understand that they are happening. From an insurance perspective, what can we do to mitigate the loss, after it's happened? Because it's going to happen. I don't think anybody's going to argue that we're going to have more of these storms as time goes on. So far this year, we already have a record drought in California. I was on the phone with an agent in Arizona. They're having a severe drought in the West Coast. So we know that's going to lead to other things, be it wildfires or even flash floods because of the drought. The seawater temperatures continue to increase a little bit. They're pretty warm. I live on the East Coast, and we all know that the warmer the water is, the bigger the storm, and the more storms we have. The other thing that's very interesting, these severe convective storms. We had this thing they called the Drought, I think I'm saying that right, in Iowa last year that caused over $1 billion of damage. We had hurricane force straight line winds throughout the state of Iowa. So it not only destroyed buildings, destroying cornfields. That was kind of a unique thing. Hopefully we're not seeing more of that, but we might. You never know. And so these are the things we're going to focus on today. So here's the latest forecast, and this is from NOAA, and we can argue all day accuracy, but over the years, they're pretty accurate about these things. We're going to have 13 to 20 named storms. 6 to 10 of those are going to be hurricanes, 3 to 5 major hurricanes, 3, 4, or 5. So what this tells me is, do you think that's important if you are an insurance agent in the Gulf Coast or the East Coast of the United States? I would say it's very important. But what we're talking about today are things that have impact not only the East Coast and the Gulf Coast, but really almost the entire country. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I thought we'd have a little fun with this. These are the names for 2021 storms. And I think we already had Claudette. That was a little tropical storm we had last week, but I don't think did too much damage, what I can gather. But, there again, it made landfall. So we've had Claudette. And you can see moving on from there, the names that we're going to see. One thing I thought was kind of interesting is let's drop all the way down to the V name. So we have Victor. Let's hope maybe we won't even get to Victor this year, or if we do, Victor will be a very mild little storm that never makes landfall. I think that would be my hope for Tropical Storm Victor. Thought I'd throw that in there. So let's touch on this severe convective storms. I was talking to my college-age son the other day, and I mentioned severe convective storms, and he goes, "Dad, you mean thunderstorms?" I'm like, yeah, sometimes we come up with these fancy names, but I do think severe convective storms kind of paint a picture, because they could be the Drought straight line winds in Iowa. They could be the F4 tornado in Alabama. They could be a severe thunderstorm that hits Lafayette, Louisiana. These are all severe convective storms. And there has been, in the last number of years, a major increase in these storms, to the point where the reinsurers are taking a hard look at writing business in a lot of these affected areas, number one. And number two, I thought this was interesting, is I've always been told Tornado Alley is, Texas, North Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, that's Tornado Alley. Well, now they're starting to move the worst of this east. And I guess there's another name I heard, it's called Dixie Alley. So we're starting to see a lot of severe convective storms in the areas east of the traditional Tornado Alley. Arkansas, Missouri, Southern Illinois, Kentucky, Tennessee, North Alabama gets a lot of press these days, a lot of tornado activity. And these aren't just little tornadoes. These things are doing a lot of damage. So one thing that we're starting to see in our business too, which I find very interesting, is the use of mandatory wind deductibles in inland areas. And I scratched my head at first, but now I'm beginning to understand why. So you might see a 1 or 2% mandatory wind and hail deductible in places like Illinois and Iowa, and even north of there. I saw one in Minnesota not too long ago. So the agents there at first were like, what in the world? I mean, the coastal agents all know about mandatory wind deductibles, but now the inland agents are learning about it too. So the reason I bring that up is you need to really sit down and explain to your insureds what is a wind deductible, what's a percentage wind deductible. Now the coastal agents, is it a named storm deductible or not? We need to know that. We need to know each company applies the rules a little differently. So you definitely need to know the coverage form and the deductible form that you're selling. So I like this picture. I mean, it's kind of a scary picture. Paints a bleak picture of the West Coast, but the water supplies are way down in places like Southern California, as I said earlier, over to Arizona and New Mexico. And one thing I've noticed, and we've experienced this in the last couple of years, is there's a lot of development out there right up against the national forest. So some of these, you can see where you have a developed area and then a mountain, where they build these really nice frame houses, by the way, on the mountain. And the reason I bring that up is a lot of times you'll see, like in this picture, the homes down here are protection class 3. But once you move up on that mountain and start building, it might be protection class 9, because there's no water supply up on the mountain. We're seeing that, and they're building these multi-million-dollar homes on the edge of these cities in the West Coast, and they're unprotected. So to say they're at a risk and it makes the builder's underwriter nervous is an understatement. So we just have to make sure these things are classified correctly. And that does bring up a point about protection class. We did a whole webinar on that. Everybody wants to always give me the distance to the fire department. Well, it's only 4 miles. It's only 3 miles to the fire department. But the next question is, what is the water supply? Is there a working fire hydrant? Well, yeah, there's one a mile away. Well, that doesn't do us any good. So, I mean, you have to dig a little deeper to get these protection classes correct. And now we have a lot of split classes where you'll have is protected in part of an area and unprotected in another part. usually because of the water supply, there's no working hydrants. So just something to be aware of. You need to understand where your builders are building, so they understand if you can get coverage on some of these things in unprotected areas, it's usually at least twice the rate, sometimes 3 times the rate. So the capacity dries up, it's tougher, probably going to have to sell higher deductibles. So just a wildfire thing. And always be careful when they're building up against a national forest, because those things, as beautiful as they are, there's a lot of fuel source there. So we've had a couple big claims in the last few years. I will say the building codes are getting a little better. They're starting to build the roofing materials out of fire resistant stuff, and they're starting to keep the job site and the areas clear. Those are some of the things they're doing. So it's getting a little better, but it's something we got to watch in the future for you West Coast folks. Touch on flood real quick. This is the one thing from an underwriting perspective, flood has always been something that's really hard to underwrite against, if you ask me, because basically everything it touches, it ruins. Whether it's salt water or fresh water, flooding does a lot of damage. And we spend a lot of time talking about windstorm, tropical windstorm, but the vast majority of the damage comes from flood. So this is another issue, and just about every property form and builder's risk form in the world excludes flood as a peril. So you have to get specialized coverage for it. Usually you have waiting periods, you have different deductibles on the flood policy. A lot of times you have sublimits on the flood policy. These are all the things that you need to know when you sell flood, and then by all means, make sure you offer it to your insureds, because it's probably excluded on their main form. So we think there's going to be more floods in the future, simply because of all the catastrophic events we talked about earlier. If you have more tropical storms, you're going to have more floods. If you have more convective storms in the Midwest, you're going to have more floods. And like I said, it's kind of interesting, if you have a drought, that's also going to lead to more flash floods. So you have inland floods, coastal floods, something that you really need to dive into and make sure you cover with your insureds. And one other note on floods is, they used to say, it's a once in 500 year event. It's a once in this. And then I had an agent in a flood affected area say, yeah, we've had a once in 500 year event every year for the last 5 years. So it starts being a little less when you say that. So just keep in mind, I would always offer flood as a peril. So you need to review your existing forms. We've gone through this time and time again with builder's risk, but it's inland marine, basically an uncontrolled line of business. There's a lot of proprietary forms out there, and the coverages are dramatically different. So you need to understand the form you're selling. There's a few, ISO has a form, AAIS has a form, but then each carrier kind of puts their own twist on these forms. We call them automatic coverages. You need to understand what those automatic coverages are and understand the sublimits tied to those coverages. Once again, windstorm, just going to cover it really quick. Obviously, the coastal agents know a lot about this. One of the derivatives of this is a named storm, windstorm deductible form. You do need to look at each carrier's form and how they define what a named storm is. It's not the CNN anchor decided to call it, terrible thunderstorm number 2. That's not really a named storm. Most of the time it's tied to NOAA or some weather authority that is assigned a name. But once again, you need to make sure on the form that you're selling how they determine what a named storm is. Because what that says is, once the storm is named, the deductible applies. If it's not named, maybe that deductible doesn't apply. So that's how important that is. We see some flat deductibles where a company will say our minimum wind deductible is $25,000 on wind. What we see more of, though, is a percentage wind deductible, which is a percentage of the value, and that can be calculated a couple of different ways. Usually on builder's risk, it's a percentage of the completed value of the structure, but sometimes it's a percent of the value at risk. 2 dramatically different ways of calculating the percentage wind deductible. So make sure you understand that in the form you're selling. And like I said earlier, we're starting to see these mandatory wind deductibles in all kinds of inland areas, which I think the personal lines carriers kind of started that with homeowners, but we're starting to see it in commercial lines now too. So definitely, especially with frame construction, underwriters are worried about frame construction and the winds. So you're going to start seeing, or if you haven't already, pretty much wind deductibles everywhere. Maybe not on the West Coast as much, but definitely in the Midwest and East, you're going to see mandatory wind deductibles. One other thing that I've seen happen time and time again, and it's a little kind of scares me sometimes for you agents out there, but a lot of times in builder's risk, the coverage lapses because it's not a standard policy that renews. You have to request the carrier, you have to tell the carrier to renew it or extend it. And if you forget, now the storm is bearing down on the coast of Georgia and you forgot to extend that coverage and the policy has lapsed. So you call your underwriter and they say, well, we're sorry, the storm is within 600 nautical miles of the coast. We cannot bind coverage. So now you're sitting there with a pretty sizable exposure because the coverage lapsed and you can't bind the coverage, can't amend coverage at that point. So what I'm saying is that's something you need to do before the storm. Any buildings that you have insured that are in harm's way, make sure you've extended that coverage before the storm forms. So that's something you should be doing now. So, and I have seen that happen time and time again. So, all right. So now now the storm's going to happen. What do we do? Let's spend a little bit of time on this. First of all, some of this seems like common sense. Years ago, I talked to an agent in southern Mississippi that had a lot of this in place, and their agency was destroyed. The town they were in was destroyed. The vast majority of their insureds property was destroyed, but they had this plan in place. They had all their records backed up. They had their employees set up so they could go to work right away, and they got back on track very quickly. It was very impressive for a relatively small town agent in southern Mississippi. They got back up and running very quickly and have grown substantially since then because the community saw how important they were to the rebuilding effort. So these are some of the things you need to do. Make sure all the contact information is updated. You know, what's all the claims, the different claims contacts for the different carriers that you sell. Make sure you have that updated. You know, you don't have an email address from an adjuster that retired 5 years ago. Obviously, the documents, we all know they're backed up on the cloud somewhere, but I definitely would test that to make sure that all of your documents, emails and such are backed up. I would also work it out with my existing employees saying in the event of a storm, if we set up a temporary office, will you be able to get there? You know, sometimes they're going to say, well, no, I can't. I have a family, I take care of them first. Everybody understands that. But you do have to have some kind of team that can be up and running pretty quick. One thing we've seen too, a lot of times these storms do a lot of damage to construction materials that are just left out in the open. So this time of year, work with your builders to make sure as much as possible that the materials are protected. You know, that could be as simple as, you know, tying them down somehow, or if the building is enclosed, put the materials inside the building. Those little things can mitigate a lot of property damage. So that's just a little loss control tip that we've seen. Because, as I said, some of our largest claims have been on property left in the open. So this is another thing. Make sure your insureds know who to call. You know, a lot of this is when there's a claim, that's when we shine and we're different than other companies and other industries. So we got to make sure they know how to get a hold of the adjuster, be it on the phone or the email. They need to have that information. The other thing too is make sure you encourage your insureds to look at the adjusters as part of their team, because the better information they give them, the better the claims is going to be settled. I say that because I've been involved in some claims where it gets a little contentious. So it'd be better if we all looked at each other as a team. We're trying to get it done right. And the bottom line is we're trying to get the claim paid fairly for the insured. So this is something that happens a lot after the storm. We get an agent calls us and they say, we want to write a builder's risk policy on this existing building and it was damaged by the storm. So then as the underwriter says, okay, what was done? And the agent says, well, I really don't know. Well, we can't make a decision on whether we're going to insure that existing building if we don't know the detailed scope of what was done to it. You know, what happened, number one. And number two is we'll say, and then the agent goes, oh, by the way, the claim is still open. If the claim is still open, I don't think you can expect someone to come in and insure that building. You know, it's that you're going to have to get the claim closed first, then we can insure it after that. So in a better case would be you call and you say, you know, there was some minor water damage to this building and now they got to restore it. So you're going to write coverage on that. You have an idea of the amount of the claim. You have an idea of what they've done to mitigate the problem since it happened. Then you can get the coverage placed. It's all about providing detailed information to your underwriters. So that was kind of it in a nutshell as far as the catastrophes that we see every year and some of the little issues that we see. So what I'd like to do now is open it up to questions and answers. Any questions on anything to do with catastrophes or just builder's risk in general? Speak now.
All right, Jeff. First question. Why is it so important to report the details on any open claim when submitting builder's risk to the carrier?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I just went over that. But so the way I look at this is if an underwriter initially is going to say, no, we don't want to provide coverage on a storm damaged building. That's the initial response is no, decline. We're not going to do it. But if you have the details, and let's just determine that it's a relatively minor claim with minor damage, an underwriter could probably be talked into providing coverage for that. So I guess the main thing is you're trying to get that coverage placed. So how do I do it? And you do it by providing detailed information. Good question.
All right. And at what point should you tell the underwriter the coverage needs to be extended?
Well, the underwriter and me, I'm saying you need to do it as soon as you become aware of it. So a lot of times, you know, it's just a question of, are you in pretty good contact with your insureds? Because if you know that, you know, you wrote a 12-month policy and it's a, you know, multi-million-dollar building and you happen to drive by it and it didn't look like it was too far advanced, you better get on the phone and ask the builder, you know, what are we looking at now? You know, if they say, well, I'm only going to be half done and I need to extend it, well, you need to go ahead and extend that as soon as you become aware of it. For that reason that I told you, where the storm is bearing down, you do not want to have to go through trying to get it covered because probably can't once the storm is established. So I guess the answer, simple answer is stay in contact, and as soon as you become aware of the fact that the project needs to be extended, make sure the underwriter knows that. Good question.
All right. So what are you seeing as far as increases in building costs after a major storm in addition to the current supply chain issues?
Yeah, so number one is we're seeing a big increase in building materials. So we're seeing the average value of a home going up, you know, 30, 40% in a lot of parts of the country. So that's number one, and that has nothing to do with the catastrophes. So now if you throw let's throw a wildfire in the west and a tropical storm in the east, what do you think that's going to do to lumber prices? I think they're going to go up even more. So that begs the question to make sure you work with the builders that these things are adequately insured. So, you know, whatever they're going to put into that project, what's going to cost them, that's what the builder's risk policy needs to be written at. Good question.
All right. And how difficult do you think it will be to get coverage for oceanfront properties in the future?
Yeah, that's a good one. So today, at least in builder's risk, and I'm not going to really cover permanent property, that's another conversation, but on builder's risk, our program, we have 1,000-foot rule in the East Coast and the Gulf Coast, which basically says within 1,000 feet of the coast, we don't write wind coverage. And they're all over the place. Every carrier looks at that a little different. That's how we look at it. So today, if you want to place coverage in builder's risk right on the beach, that's a specialized line of business, usually done in the non-admitted excess and surplus lines world. And yeah, I think that's probably going to continue because the standard carriers, are constantly, it's kind of funny though. I mean, I shouldn't say funny, but we always wanted to write the inland business because it was less risky. But now because of severe convective storms, that's becoming risky too. So I guess the bottom line is, I think the pricing on all this is going to go up based on loss experience. Because as you have more storms, you're going to have more claims, and you're just going to see the rates going up. So that's probably going to happen. But hopefully that answers that. I think I did.
All right. Well, it looks like those were all of the questions we have today, so we can wrap up a few minutes early.
Very good. Well, once again, we really, really appreciate, let me put this on this, really appreciate your time today to listen about builder's risk. We are open for business. We have capacity. We want to write business. Current program now is in 48 states. We're everywhere, 48 states, plus the District of Columbia. The contiguous 48 states we are in. We readily want to write business. We have capacity now, coast to coast. So give us a call, pick up the phone, call us, go to our portal. It's right there, buildersrisk.us at victoryusinsureds.com. We'd love to hear from you, and whatever you got builders risk wise, give us a call and we'll talk to you. Thanks again and have a great day.